Log on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
Good. Well, it's a great pleasure to welcome someone whom I'm sure a number of you have been speaking to already during the course of this week. Someone who is an old friend of mine, well, relatively old friend compared to some here, but who is speaking for us for the first time at one of these summer courses. And so we're very pleased that Dr. David Lahti is able to come over for this week. David is from Queen's College City University of New York. He's assistant professor of biology there and also the undergraduate research coordinator in his college. And he's running a behavior and evolution laboratory which focuses mainly on learned behavior in both birds and humans. And if you know about this field, that's pretty rare to have a lab which is actually looking at birds and humans both in the same laboratory. And so who better than to come to give us two talks, in fact, during the course on evolutionary biology, and the topic for us this morning is human behavior in the genes. So thank you very much, David.
Thank you, and thank you all for coming. It's great to be here. My first time in, not only at the Faraday Institute, but in Cambridge. So it's wonderful to see the beautiful city out there and everything. And it is interesting. It sounds strange to study birds and humans at the same time, but actually maybe it would be less strange if I gave you the top two best understood systems of learning in terms of understanding their evolution, their genetics, and their function. The number one behavior, I think, in the entire world that's understood in terms of its learning in all of these facets is birdsong. And number two is human language, and there are a lot of similarities between the learning processes there. So that's sort of how it makes sense to me anyway. But anyway, I want to start by acknowledging a long-standing controversy in the answer to this question: how is the human mind shaped? People in different disciplines tend to address it in different ways. So, for instance, evolutionary psychology, biological anthropology, and allied fields tend to answer it broadly through evolution in an ancestral environment, whereas classical psychology and the more cultural side of anthropology addresses it through experience in the current environment. And so these seem, on the face of things, to be opposed to each other. And by long-standing, I mean that the controversy or the issue long predates these disciplines. So examples from a couple of wizardly icons here. Plato tended to think of education as the ultimate shaper of our ideas. There's a quote from Theaetetus: "I would have you imagine then that there exists in the mind of man a block of wax," etc. Whereas Darwin expressed that education experience he thought had a relatively small effect on us, which may not be too surprising to you. He's inclined to believing that most of our qualities are innate. Now, I emphasize these aspects just to show you the issue, but in fact that both of these thinkers had more subtle views than this. So, for instance, Plato thought that some of the ideas that were impressed on the block of wax were pre-existing and either impressed on us by God or impressed on us by a strange kind of mythical history that is actually uncanny in its resemblance to evolution. And Darwin, on the other hand, supposed that several of our behaviors that we have, our psychological tendencies, are not inherited. So, for instance, one of my favorite ones is that the idea for expanding equal moral consideration to all people is something that he thought would be a worthy goal, but something that we don't inherit. There's no evolutionary precedent for it, so we have to teach it in order to encourage its spread. Okay, so we all have our opinions on this matter, of course. I mean, it's coffee table conversation. And so this is an example from the National Opinion Resource Center in Chicago. The percentage of people saying that how life turns out is because of the genes has a variety of, there's a lot of variability in the population, but strangely enough, it's not influenced too much by education. It's influenced a lot by age. People tend to increase, or at least Americans, I guess, here in this sample, tend to increase in their respect for the influence of the genes as they get older, and you can speculate about why that might be the case. But the fact that it's not influenced by education means that people don't understand genetics and don't understand biology very well, because education is obviously not helping them in that matter either way. So anyway, this question becomes important. This question that I pitted Darwin against Plato here becomes important to us as the relevance of nature versus nurture, acquired versus innate characteristics, genes versus environment, or learning versus unlearning. And for nearly a century now, and actually implicitly long before that, biology, I would argue, has been the field that has most directly approached this issue, and these and many other study systems have allowed us to see how in the natural world, not particularly with respect to humans, but how in the natural world more generally, the genes and other factors cooperate essentially to influence organismal traits, such as behavior, which is just one of many kinds of traits that are complex enough to have to worry about this question. So we can start here. First, what I'll do is I'll give you some general conclusions or insights in sort of a verbal theoretical framework that will be, and I will be highly selective. I will only give you those things that I think are essential for moving on then to understanding human behavior. And then I'll bring in some human examples, and then I'll talk about what kinds of influences are probably acting in cases where differences aren't due to genetic influence. But first, probably the most important thing that I would want you to get from this lecture would be this next slide, which is nothing on it. No, I'm just kidding. Which is the idea that genes and environment shape behavior through development. I tell my students, if you can think about this every time you read a biological article in a magazine or newspaper, or every time you think about a trait and try to explain it, you will be much better off than even most biologists when they're actually doing their work, because they're usually concentrating almost always on one or at most two aspects of this, but all three of them, genes, environment, and development, are absolutely necessary. And so I would say that all traits are 100% genetic and all traits are 100% environmental, in this sense that no trait is exhibited without a genetic basis, and no trait is expressed outside of any environment. And I think the best way to explain this, or to show it, is with a picture, and a picture from an alumnus of Cambridge here, C.H. Waddington, who constructed this epigenetic landscape model for understanding precisely this thing. So if you think of here the whole landscape and the ball itself being the genotype, and the rolling down the hill of the ball being development, so when you get to the bottom you die, and at the top you're just hatched. And the environment is just things that might influence the ball rolling one way or another as it rolls down the hill through gravity. So like winds blowing across the landscape or something like that, you can imagine. So this is how I would view the way those three things interact, and you can see that none of them is possible without the others. And I want to introduce two terms here, and I'll come back to this graph and interpret them, that show how the shape of this landscape reflects the interaction between genes, environment, and development. And this is canalization and plasticity. Canalization, first, is the robustness of developmental pathways. So that's the rolling of the ball down the hill of development. The robustness of that to perturbations, either from genetic changes or environmental changes that might derail it. Whereas plasticity is the ability of a single genotype, so an organism only has one genotype generally speaking, to produce different traits in different environments. Now these are not opposites, and they're often taught as opposites, even in biology department. So canalization has to do with how perturbable the developmental pathway is, so how changeable it is, whereas plasticity has to do with how many of them are possible, or how wide the breadth of possibilities are, which is a different question. And I'll show you some examples of how they differ later. But so going back here, how many troughs there are is one measure of the degree of plasticity. You can see there are 4 possible endpoints for this ball here. And so that's the plasticity. whereas the height of the walls between the troughs is canalization. That is, once we start rolling on the on this side, for instance, let's say it's not working here. Oh, there we go. Once we start rolling on this side of this, if this is sufficiently high, this ridge, then the ball will remain on that side and will be irreversibly on that side. So it's canalized, and no perturbation from the environment, for instance, could ever get that ball over that hill into another developmental pathway. It's imperturbable. Whereas very high plasticity in low canalization, the extreme case would be if there were no hills whatsoever and it was all flat. The ball could roll back and forth across the landscape. And so you can see how this plasticity and canalization interact with each other. The genes which are responsible for the landscape and the environment which is responsible for where the ball is going on the landscape as the ball rolls down, which is development, is basically the story of how traits are affected. So when I ask a simple question in the title, is human behavior in the genes? Now, if you look at it from this perspective, you can see how that's almost a nonsensical kind of question. It's an old-fashioned question that reflects a not up-to-date understanding of the way genes, environment, and development interact. But still, it's helpful just as a title. So I want to tell you a little bit more about phenotypic plasticity before moving on. I had already mentioned the definition of this, but there are two different kinds of plasticity based on the degree of canalization. Okay, so, and I've already alluded to this. One is irreversible. So a particular kind of plasticity where you could develop this kind of trait or you could develop this kind of trait, but once you start going on one of those pathways, you can't change, is called generally developmental plasticity. It means development forces you along the road and you can't get off of it once you're starting on it. But in the beginning you can choose, well, not choose, but your environment determines which pathway you go on. And there are many examples of this in nature. They were first found in other organisms besides humans, of course. Depending on what kind of environment, especially predators, that barnacles and tadpoles will experience in nature, they end up producing different traits and they can't go back and forth between them. This is just the way they develop. Now in humans, this has been studied relatively recently. The first book on plasticity was, I believe, in 2005, and there were two of them. So that just shows you, actually there was one in 1998, but the first on the distinction between developmental plasticity and reversible plasticity and actually applying those to humans is a relatively recent study, but it's growing like gangbusters. This is Franz Liszt on the left, who has amazingly large and quick fingers. Well, he's not alive anymore, but recent research suggests that the ability to move one's fingers very, very quickly, like a virtuosic pianist or violinist or electric guitarist would do, is something that is influenced by some developmental plasticity, such that if you start doing these fast finger movements after 12 years old, there's no likelihood that you will be as fast as you would if you started much earlier than this. Likewise, there's also some evidence. There was older circumstantial evidence, and it's been strengthened more recently, that the kinds of sounds that we produce is also under some developmental plasticity, where we are very broad in our ability to produce different phonemes when we're very young. But then after about 3 to 6 months of life, there's about an 18 to 36 month pattern of attrition where we lose the ability to produce phonemes or particular sounds that we never hear. And so that's another example of this developmental plasticity in human behavior. So it's a way that the genes which are responsible for those hills between which our traits lie govern how likely we are to be able to get out of a pathway once we're in it. Okay. Now, plasticity can also be reversible, and that's what people generally mean when they don't append developmental to it, when they just say it's plastic. The assumption is usually that it's reversible and can go back and forth. And there are two types even of this, biased and open-ended plasticity. So learning is probably the most well-studied form of plasticity because it's a way that the environment can influence one's trait. But there are many other ways in which that can happen. Now, every time learning or any other form of plasticity has been studied in depth enough to rule out equipotentiality, which means completely open-ended learning or plasticity, it has ruled it out. There are not a lot of behaviors in which those very rigorous tests and extensive tests have been done. But so far, there's no behavior of humans that has been found to be equipotential or completely open-ended. There are learning biases, even within language, which has historically been seen. I'm going to give it as an example of one that is a great candidate for open-ended learning. But it always seems that there are learning biases involved in anything that we learn. It's often easier to learn things that are correct than false if the organisms, for instance, other organisms behave as though they know it already. Freud had it backwards when he said that the most important question of psychology should be to explain the unconscious. I would say that the most important question of psychology is to explain the conscious, because we come from unconscious, and consciousness is really the crazy and new thing. And so open-ended learning is something that's relatively new, if it exists at all, and I'm always interested in that literature to find whether we can find examples of that, learning without bias. So I wanted to give an example, lest we think that plasticity, when it has very little canalization and traits can move here and there, is just a human phenomenon. I'll give an example at the other end of the psychological complexity spectrum. An amoeba has a solid form and a gel form, and it can exist in all the space in between, and does so in response to environmental variables. So if you have a piece of glass and you just have it flat, and it's below its optimal temperature, and you shine a light on it, it will become almost like a liquid and spread out on the surface of the glass. But then once it gets to temperature, if you start to turn it like this, instead of running off the glass, if it wants to stay where it is, now let me just take that as anthropomorphic, but it tends to solidify and extend pseudopodia. And so this is actually not even exclusively behavioral. It's a morphological change that is completely reversible on very short space of time. Sometimes maintaining plasticity all through development is difficult for a lot of traits, even for behavioral traits, but it's rarer for morphological traits to do that. Humans, for instance, although some canalization can happen for many behaviors, there's significant plasticity for many learned traits like speaking and understanding languages throughout life. I remember when I was very young in a Catholic school, I learned that Pope John Paul II spoke all these languages, and I was flabbergasted. But that's another example of plasticity, and very important in his line of work. Genes and environment shape behavior through development. I had mentioned this before, and I think most people think of the issue being primarily between genes and environment, so I think it's important for me to talk a little bit about development before I go on to examples. Biologists call development ontogeny, although development is used often synonymously with ontogeny. And literally it means the origin of existence, so ontology is the study of existence, onto, and geny, like Genesis, is the beginning. It has to do really with the development of one organism through time. It's not evolution. And I would say, in general, the best theoretical thing I can say about development is that it's best to think of genes as controlling not traits, but the development of the organism. If you look at the way that, that genes operate, they operate through a developmental process. We tend to think of things as more static and atomic than they really are in life. Everything is a process in biology. Almost everything is a process and has to be seen in that light, and it actually changes the way we think about things. I'll give you an example here. Someone mentioned at table a couple days ago Caenorhabditis elegans as a great example of modern biology's use of a relatively humble organism. It's a nematode worm to come up with lots of interesting test lots of interesting hypotheses and develop evolutionary theory, and relating to development in particular. And it is a good example. So here we have on the outer ring the life cycle of C. elegans in terms of its germline or reproduction. And on the inner circle is the growth. So the life cycle in terms of the organism of growth. Now, this organism has all the same complement of genes. And many of them, the ones that are governing growth and reproduction, are turned on most of the time. And so what you have here is the same genes operating so as to bring about a developing organism that looks very different from an egg to different stages of growth, and then having both the germline and just a survival stage. So researchers can watch how genes turn on and off, how the same outputs of the genes in terms of what they're coding for do different things at different times in this cycle, and how mutations actually warp this circle and change the way the organism lives and reproduces. And so this is really the most complete way of looking at the way that genes control any kinds of traits, is to look at it through development. Now, it's more complicated when we come to other organisms. We can't as easily do it as we can in C. elegans, but it's a great reminder of how we should do this. And I would summarize the inspiration that we get from something like C. elegans as there are many genes, one development. Many genes have to be funneled through a single developmental pathway for any given organism. And that's a realization from Theodosius Dobzhansky, actually. He's the one who first realized the importance of that. His way of saying it is, he was talking more about inheritance being particulate, so there are different genes and different chromosomes, but development is unitary. So again, we have all of these genes being inherited, but one development. And so just that realization should have taught us a long time before we realized it, that all of the, I've already told you that, I'm going to give you another one here, all of these exceptions to Mendelian inheritance, at least my textbook when I was going to school, proposed Mendelian inheritance and proposed genes controlling traits sort of additively and kind of directly as being the standard. And then you throw a few wrenches in there like friction, including epistasis, which is when one gene has an effect on another. Pleiotropy is when several genes are responsible for the same thing. They have to cooperate in order to produce the same thing. And polygenic, when one gene does more than one thing, I switched these two. So pleiotropy is when one gene does more than one thing, has more than one function. And polygenic effects are when multiple genes are responsible for a single trait. These things, Dobzhansky realized, are everywhere. They're not exceptions to the Mendelian rule. They are the rule. It's more like the Mendelian system is what would be going on like in a Hardy-Weinberg situation where we hardly ever see it, about evolutionary biology. If not, just forget it. It's a situation with no natural selection, which is something that we hardly ever see in nature, for instance. No evolution either. So anyway, while I'm on the subject of cardinal rules, and these aren't anything that anyone has really developed, I'm just presenting these to you because I think that these 4 rules will help us more than any other to realize the importance of the interaction between genes and environment and development and controlling traits, and how we should answer the question of whether human behavior is in the genes. One that is not very often recognized is that all genetic influence on behavior is through morphology, without exception. You can think of that in different ways. Start from the outer manifestation. Behavior is what morphology does. It doesn't exist in a background, in a vacuum. It is what morphology does. And so, at the most basic level, behavior changes through evolution, not directly, but through changes in muscles, hormones, neurons. And if you want to take it from the other perspective and start at the DNA, DNA codes for proteins. DNA is translated into mRNA. mRNA is translated into amino acids, which link together into proteins, and from there they do something else. But proteins themselves are morphological structures, and any behavior that they influence down the road must be seen as a less direct consequence of the genes than those morphologies. But you should also be wary. So that's a wariness of seeing behavior as too directly connected to genes. But for the same, by the same token, I would be wary of statements that morphology is controlled by genes, but behavior is not. I mean, Stephen Jay Gould comes pretty close to saying that in a lot of cases, and this isn't really his field, but he talked a lot about it. But morphology is what produces behavior. I mean, if you take an Anolis lizard and its morphology changes by evolution, the length of its leg changes, its running behavior is going to change. And in the same way, neurons in the brain are often more directly coded for by the genes than, say, our behavior that is responsible for. But you may be able to draw a causal connection between those because the neural structure of the brain is responsible for behavior, well, responsible for psychology and behavior, I could say. Okay. Now, but we should also recognize, as I said, that extra layer of complexity that the intervening morphology requires. Now, the fourth, and probably least appreciated of all by people that are outside of the field, it's almost like a secret of evolutionary genetics, of population genetics, is that heritability, which is what we're taught as being the indicator of the importance of the genes, does not actually tell you necessarily much about the importance of the genes. So heritability is the proportion of the variance of a trait in the population that is due to inheritance rather than the environment. So it's due to the genes rather than environment. And the way that generally we test this, it goes from 0 to 1, is you can, I could impose selection on this room, for instance. So I could just kill everybody with gray hair, say. And then we would, that would actually be a little unfortunate because that develops in such a way that everyone in this room will eventually have it. So maybe that's not the best example. Maybe blue eyes and brown eyes or something like that. But I'm not even getting into that. If there was a... Okay, so if I exerted selection on a population someplace, and you look at the next generation, the way that we would assess heritability is to take the change that successfully was transmitted to the next generation, the change in the frequency of that particular allele or trait, if we're looking at the actual traits, subtract the difference in environment, because that must have the correlation with environment, and then what we're left with is the importance of the genes. But let's say I did that, and there was a heritability of 0. That could indicate that all of the difference was correlated with environmental differences. So exert selection, you come with the next generation, there's an environmental correlation, I remove the environmental correlation, there's nothing left. Aha, so all the change that we see was due to environmental influences. Now that's generally what's assumed, and that is one possible interpretation. But a second interpretation, and this is fully realized in the field, it's just something that we have to deal with, and that is that past selection has removed all variation. So if you have a trait that is enormously important, such that it goes to fixation, meaning that everybody has the trait eventually, and you exert selection on it, in the next generation you have no change, because it is already fit to the environment, you will have a heritability of 0. Does that make sense? It doesn't make sense intuitively, but it makes sense given the way that population geneticists need to use the concept of heritability, because they're talking about evolutionary change. So we've moved from the importance of genetics and evolutionary change to the importance of genetics for understanding the trait. And that's a slide that often lay people will do, and even biologists who are not accustomed to population genetics will use heritability to infer the importance of the genes. A third possibility is that there is a gene-environment covariation. So actually, organisms are selected such that their trait will be fit in all of the environments that they will see, not only in one. And the way you do that is by plasticity, such as developmental plasticity, where you have two different traits. Let's say I am a migratory organism, and I live in this environment for half my life, and this environment for half my life, and I go back and forth between them. A trait that or even this in one generation, in this in the next generation. That's even better. So most likely what selection will do is will hone the capacity for plasticity to maintain adaptations to both of those traits. You use an environmental cue in this environment, and then you're fit for that environment when you're there, and you use an environmental cue and you're fit for this environment when you're there. In that kind of situation, if you have selection on a population in this environment, and then it gives rise to the next generation, which is in this environment, you will see an environmental correlation. You will exclude the importance of the genes, and you'll come up with a zero heritability, even though the genes in my theoretical example were entirely responsible for that change, or that trait. So, well, not entirely, I mean, in interaction, but I mean, they were important. So you have to be careful about interpreting heritabilities. And I would say another conclusion that we would draw from Dobzhansky's insight about the development being unitary, as well as the ubiquity of these genetic interactions, is that you have to be careful for any kind of idea of one gene, one trait kind of view. It's almost ridiculous. It's definitely simplistic. Even in an extreme case, probably the most extreme case in human cases are the one mental disorder that we know to be caused by a single gene is Huntington's disease. But even there, Huntington's disease, yes, whether you have it or not, is controlled by a single gene. But many other genes in the genome will contribute to the symptoms of Huntington's disease, despite the fact that they are normal genes in interaction with the disease-causing gene itself. So even in that kind of situation, we're talking about the action of many genes. There's never a case, never, in an organism with more than one gene where one gene is solely responsible for one trait. It can't possibly be the case because you have a developmental process that's controlled by the entire genome. Okay, there's many other wrinkles I could present. I'm actually not going to go into detail here. I could talk about meiotic drive, genomic imprinting, specific kinds of gene by environment interactions, epigenetics. All of these things are further wrinkles of how development and environment and genes interact. Maternal effects is one. Maternal genes can have an effect not only on the mother's traits herself, but on the offspring traits. And not only offspring traits that are expressed while she is taking care of them, but also traits that are expressed much later in development. It's quite amazing. This is not only found in mice, it's first found in mice, can be found in humans as well, where the amount of parental care early in life can influence the amount of mRNA that is found in the hippocampus later on, expressed by stress relief genes in adulthood. Okay, so there's that. Now the task for human biology, I would say, is to appropriate what we have learned from a general study of nature to humans, in particular, to tackle the increased psychological complexity and plasticity of human behavior per se. But it's not a problem that we don't try to tackle in other organisms. In a general form, it's something that's common to many organisms. And I just show the example here of Hox genes to emphasize the shared genetic basis that we have with other organisms. The homologous gene, or the gene that's inherited from a common ancestor, works to control the body separation in fruit flies and in humans. And so our study of fruit flies actually benefits our study of humans and the understanding of where limbs are supposed to go. Now, I want to give a few examples of the genetic influence on human behavior. I will just set aside very quickly twin studies, which are the most common form and most long-standing form of studies of the genetic influence on human psychology and behavior, particularly on many different traits, both psychological, behavioral, and then morphological as well. Often they're comparing twins reared together with twins reared apart and seeing the differences there. Or monozygotic twins versus dizygotic twins. Dizygotic twins come from two separate sperm and egg that were mature in the same mother, and so you can compare those with a single zygote that is split. Anyway, so even more interesting, I would say, today, because of the greater power they have in specificity in locating the particular genes involved, are mechanistic studies. And there are about 10 to 15 such studies a year now, and they're increasing. I'm just going to go into one example in a little bit of greater detail here, and that is something that I chose because I know at conferences usually people end up stressing their particular mode of daily activity cycles, and we often see this kind of situation, like in my classroom. Sometimes no, I'm just kidding. I hope I'm kidding. I don't know. They pick up their heads when I walk in. Yeah. But okay, we all have circadian rhythms. We all have rhythms that dictate sleep-wake cycles, and there's variation in individuals between that. Now, previous twin studies had pointed out that there is a genetic basis for this, some portion of these differences. Now, one interesting realization is that we have these genes that code for periodicity not only in the organs where they are used in the brain, but also in all of our other cells. So you can take your cheek cells and find out your, look at the genes that code for periodicity. That's just the way multicellularity works. You have genes that you don't need in places because you have your entire genome in all of your cells. So researchers in Berlin in 2007 gave a questionnaire to several people, and they asked them to define, or they asked themselves many questions, and from these questions the researchers gathered whether these individuals are more to the lark end of the spectrum, where they would get up early and go to bed early, or the owl end of the spectrum, where they just never want to go to sleep and end up being tired in the morning because they stay up too late in the night. And Tim's smiling. I don't know if that's because you are or because you think I am. Okay. Anyway, so
what happens when a lark hangs out with an owl?
That's right. Yeah. Well, in my experience, the owl is always able to convince the lark if they are, if they are good enough. But anyway, what was interesting is that a lentivirus that has a circadian reporter, in other words, it interacts with the cells, interacts with the gene within the cell that regulates the periodicity, and reports the circadian by bioluminescing along the same period that the gene codes for. So it's basically like an electrician's tester. You can put this virus in there, and luciferase will cause it to bioluminesce. And so that was done, and we got these bioluminescent traces here, differences in rhythmicity from individual to individual, and surprisingly, they correlated very strongly with reports of the people as to what they were. And these were just dermal cells that we get this information from. So larks, on the right here, tended to have shorter periods than owls do. And so the difference is very significant here. So this shows one way in which a particular gene has an influence on the daily behavior in a lot of complex kind of behaviors, like interactions of whether we should go out tonight and those kinds of things. Has some indirect influence on those things, but very important. Now there's another lesson to be learned from this, though. I'm always trying to think of cautionary tales along the way. Notice that some larks have a longer period than some owls do, if you take those extreme ends of the spectrum. I always think that in studies of human behavior, if I were more doing psychology and philosophy and that kind of thing when I'm talking about human behavior, I might be less interested in what the biologists are interested in, which is the line, trend line, and I might be more interested in the dispersion of the residuals, as we say in statistics, or the individuals that don't fall on the line, because genetic control is usually studied in terms of population differences and tendencies, but often these don't determine behavior for everyone. The variation is still there, and individuals can sort of buck the system in various ways. There are many other things going on in an individual besides this one gene. And so because of things like this, the old-fashioned, and many other things such as the interactions that I've already talked to you about, the old-fashioned worry about genetic predestination or predeterminism or determinism is neglecting how genetic variation is actually studied and how genetic control is actually studied. I just think it results from a misunderstanding. Okay, I can hardly talk about the genetics of human behavior without touching on the field in which it is most often studied. I have to admit that people in my field, in sort of pure evolutionary biology, don't often get into the medical literature for two reasons. One is that we're often interested in more broad-scale or basic science rather than applying it to a particular thing, but also because there's this perception, whether real or imagined, I don't know, that medical research is of lower quality than pure genetics is. But anyway, regardless, the mental illness has made substantial inroads, I would say more than the pure biology on model systems, into understanding the genetics of something extremely complicated like mental illness and psychological traits, and there's an enormous pressure for us to do that. Now, one conclusion from this, I would say, is that genetic predispositions, what clinicians call risk factors, have been found for every single kind of mental illness that has been studied. And that it was a surprise to some people. Twin studies have been every other psychiatric condition. Every psychiatric condition that has been studied. Twin studies were historically the most common means of studying this, but another take-home message I would say from this entire literature is that many of the same genetic influences discovered for particular mental illnesses have been found to be important in people without those illnesses for relevantly similar traits. So people that have depression and it's been related to a particular genetic difference, often that genetic difference is in a gene that we already know to be important in mood. And that is almost always the case. So just general heritabilities here. This is just typical what's generally parroted around, but it seems to be holding water. I've adjusted it a little bit for recent evidence, but heritability seems to be about 20 to 30% for anxiety disorders. This is the lower end. 30 to 40% for depression, and 50 to 60% for alcoholism, and 80% and higher for schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and autism. Now, remember what I said about the importance of realizing the caveats for heritability. What I would say here is that the heritability should be taken as a measure of the degree of the importance, not of the genes in controlling the disorder, but the difference between a person without the disorder and with the disorder. What proportion of time is there a difference, a genetic difference there, in that those are the percentages that underlie the difference in whether they have the disorder. All right, there's probably the first example realized of genetics important in human mental disorders are trisomy 21. You can see the 3 chromosomes down there, number 21, which produces Down syndrome. I believe 100% of the time. There's been some research on this. It may not quite be 100% of the time, but I think it probably will come out. Another example is schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. They're related. They share genetic roots that seem to be specific to mental disorders, serious mental disorders. On the left column are locations on chromosomes that are important in bipolar disorder. In other words, at these positions are found particular gene sequences that often people will have if they have bipolar disorder. Same on the right for schizophrenia. In the middle, shared genes for both groups. But look, every ellipse shows a kind of disorder that's in this family of disorders. So if you have changes at these locations on these chromosomes, you will have a disorder that is characterized as that. And there are many different kinds of genetic disorders that can be put into this bipolar schizophrenic family. And I should mention that although causation is not really controversial, it is important to realize that not all individuals who have the particular modifications at these locations have the disorder. Although I think it is the case that everyone who has all of them in any one of these particular ellipses develops the disorder if they live long enough. Okay, this is just a more general look. I'm I'm at the end of the example, so I just want to overwhelm you with a bunch of examples and then just move on without talking much about them. But there are many places, and I could have a list twice this long actually, but this is just from the medical genetics literature, which in contrast to the general view, I think, of evolutionary biologists, at least in this area, I've become very impressed with it. Because it's so difficult to do this kind of work, people have been forced to be very, very careful. Probably more careful than typical psychiatric papers. Anyway, there are particular variants that we know to be underlying particular effects in terms of mental illness, and we know the genes that are responsible for them. I mean, 15 years ago we couldn't have done this to any of these. This is just an amazing and very recent phenomenon. Okay, so returning to the original question that I raised, if we take the actual evidence about this question, and the theory that we should be adopting, I think, rather than just controversial pronouncements, we come up with a more integrated view. So our behavior is influenced, as Darwin suggested, by evolution, and so therefore by our genes. Some of us focus exclusively on that, and to that extent human behavior is shaped by genes, but we're also guided by ideas that we gain during our lifetime, including the influences of our culture, and others exclusively focus on these things, and there are disciplines for focusing on these things. But also we have our interactions, and so inherited tendencies will bias, I talked about learning bias, how our environment influences our psychology and our behavior, and likewise what we learn and the environment in which we develop will influence how much control and what sort of control our genes have on our behavior. And so what an evolutionary biologist would look at this and say, oh, this is just the classic situation that we have in fruit flies and C. elegans and everything else. It's that the traits are informed by evolutionary heritage and a complex interaction with plasticity. I want to conclude, it'll be a long conclusion, so don't start fidgeting yet, but by dealing with two major issues that often come up when we talk about human behavior and genes. First is culture. So in much of human behavior, changes in traits happen much more quickly than can ever happen by genetic evolution. But nevertheless, the changes often look like, if you look at the traits, they look like the changes that genetic change produces. So, for instance, look at this language tree. This is the spread of Indo-European languages, including English, from an ancestral language someplace in Western Asia. This tree looks remarkably like a gene tree that you could develop based on these same populations. There would be some differences, but it looks remarkably like the same kinds of trees. As a matter of fact, from a distance, you'd have to come up close and see whether we were talking about a cultural trait or a genetic trait, or a gene, alleles. And this is the case despite the fact that we are relatively certain that which language we speak is under very little genetic influence, if any. So in this, as in much human cultural behavior, the genes are important. They specify first a capacity, and then plasticity, so that there is an environmentally sensitive trait value, and then perhaps, but not always, like here maybe not, a bias towards one trait or another given the environment. And then much of the universals are already set there, like perhaps grammar, if evolutionary linguists are correct nowadays. But then we have a bias that is culturally imposed, not genetically imposed generally. So our experience and our cultural history makes us biased in our learning of a particular language. What language we learn is indirectly related to genotype only because it tends to be people around us that are teaching us our language, and we grow up among those who are closely related to us. And so there's this strange kind of indirect interaction between a cultural trend or cultural evolution and then past genetic evolution and the structure of human populations. That's why a language tree and a genetic tree look very similar, despite the fact that the genes are not distinguishing or important in determining what language you speak. So as you can see, it's very difficult to tease apart the interactions between genes and environment on a trait when you have this gene-environment covariation like this, but it is possible to do. I'll give you some examples now that I've given so many examples of changes that are due to genetic influence. I want to give you some that are cultural that are not. I think some cultural traits are due to genetic, do have some genetic differences that underlie cultural differences, but I'm going to give you some other ones now because I've already given some of those to you. So just to balance out all the behavioral genetics. Okay, so for instance, mating systems, monogamy versus polygyny. There are societies that are predominantly monogamous, enforce monogamy socially, culturally, and there are those that are sort of in between, and some that enforce or socially enforce or at least tolerate polygyny, which is one man having several wives. There are a couple, literally a couple, polyandrous societies too, where one woman can have several husbands. But what I'm going to suggest now is that the genes are still important in governing these traits, and they are always important, but that the differences in the traits came about not through genetic change, but through cultural change. So several social environments, I would argue, make an organism with the same genotype likely to go towards polygyny versus monogamy. So in a highly stratified society like the Maasai here in Kenya, a woman can sometimes be better off financially, which means a lot to herself and her offspring, if she were to choose to marry a man who already has a wife, because the differences, it's a highly stratified society, the differences in wealth are so great that she'd be much better off to marry him than another man who doesn't have anything. And so in that kind of situation, you often find polygyny develop. This is not because they are genetically different from those in monogamous societies. It's possible that the same genotype we all share will predispose us to monogamy in one culture and polygyny in another culture. I don't want you to draw any moral conclusions from this. I'm just giving you what can tend to happen. Now, other social environments may decrease the differences in sex roles, for instance. So since we're talking about a roughly similar kind of thing. So in many developed nations, such as the UK, in law enforcement, for instance, there is a decrease of the importance of physical traits, such as strength, and more emphasis on technology and communication and intelligence. And so these things, which are less different between the sexes than brute strength is, lead us to accept a more equality of professional opportunity and to some extent a greater equality of treatment between the two sexes in this field than is typical among cultures. And of course there's lots of other things going on that are more broad that also lead to this cultural change. But I'm not suggesting that the relative difference between men and women have changed in the last 50 years or 500 years. Genetically, this is a cultural change. Another kind of example is when we have a problem. So, for instance, when we have a difference between our environment today and that of our ancestors of long ago, and we're not about to sit around and wait for our genes to change to adapt to our new surroundings. Instead, we have what I call a cultural surrogate for adaptation. So in other words, something that we can institute culturally that can stand in for an adaptation without any genetic change being required. So for instance, sugar. The reason we like it so much, the reason we like sweetness, is because we evolved to do so on the basis of the importance of carbohydrates to our diet and its relative difficulty in finding it sometimes, and its seasonality and patchiness. And so we should eat a lot of it when we can get it. But of course now, what has happened is our technology has enabled us to produce it whenever we want, in refined form, in large quantities. And so of course, anything like that can lead to problems. And then so some people, especially children, are prone to overdoing it. So we have to regulate our kids' intake, and one thing that we do in order to do that is to create propaganda like this in order to stand in essentially for an adaptive dislike of sugar, since we're not going to be evolving that. We're essentially using our culture to combat an inherited tendency. We're fighting our genes with learning, so to speak. Another example of this is moral institutions. I think that many of the behaviors that we want to change the most about ourselves are behaviors that would have been natural for our ancestors but are not for us, and they are in need of much cultural prodding and reinforcement. I give this example of August Child Support Month in the United States as an example. Male parental care, period, is rare in mammals, and the difference in size between males and females, which suggests the degree of cooperation in raising young, has decreased rapidly over the last 6 million years. And taking care of young after a split between male and female, which is splits between males and females, like divorce, are very common in nature, even in situations where you have parental care. But the father no longer takes care of the offspring. I don't think that there is another example on Earth where that is the case besides in humans. And so, so if you appreciate this, perhaps these moral institutions, that when we encourage child support, essentially what we're doing is using a cultural institution to bolster morality in a case where morality is at variance with our earlier predispositions. I don't want to put too fine a point on it, but I think that that could generally be what is happening in a lot of these cases where we have very difficult and persisting difficulties in large proportions of the population, moral difficulties that we all agree we'd like to get away from. So then the second issue, besides culture, that I wanted to deal with, jumps right off from that, which is, okay, then why do we continue to inherit these behavioral tendencies? How come we don't just evolve away from them? And stated in other terms, if cultural change makes something backwards, how come the genes don't just acquiesce? And the reason, I think there are two main reasons why this is the case, why we don't see evolution. And a lot of people, when I talk to people about evolution who don't really understand it but have newly accepted it, they're all very often interested in the future of human evolution and how much evolution is happening right now, and can they influence the evolution of their kids, etc., that kind of thing. But these don't appreciate the scale of evolution or the mechanism of evolution, as Keith was saying earlier about different other kinds of questions. But evolutionary lag is one important thing to realize. About 100 generations of consistent natural selection would take 2,000 years in typical human society, and that's about how many generations we generally use in the laboratory in order to see significant change in behavioral traits. 75 to 150 generations oftentimes. Modern technology and cultural practices would have to continue for many hundreds of years to have an evolutionary effect, and they'd have to be consistent and very highly selective, or in other words, cause significant differences in reproductive success. And also, there's no genetic inheritance of acquired traits. That's, of course, something that probably all of you recognize. There are actually a couple of exceptions to that, but for the most part, there is no genetic inheritance of acquired traits, and so you can't speed it up by something you do in your lifetime. And then finally, cultural change proceeds so rapidly that it sometimes swamps the effects of selection, and so that consistency that I said would have to happen over a long period of time doesn't happen. So the result of these four factors is that we're unlikely to see evolution on the scale of even a few hundred or even 1,000 years unless the selection pressure is very strong and consistent. And I think there are situations like that. Resistance to cold, skin color, brain size is still increasing in human lineage. There's many things that are still evolving, but they're not due to recent modern technology and those kinds of things. That's what the point I was making. Now, the second reason why I think we continue to inherit these characteristics and don't evolve away from them is because of the relaxation of natural selection that we tend to effect. Now, sometimes we, like in terms of fashion, we create selective regimes. We create social selection. We exacerbate sexual selection, or at least capitulate to it in our mate choice and male competition, those kinds of things. But in many respects, modern societies relax natural selection with respect to the ancestral situation. So modern medical care, modern social programs, democratic political systems, they relax natural selection, and so some of the things that we might not want to see will continue to be here because of that. And I do not share the views of people like William Hamilton, for instance, who were thinking, well, how can we counteract this? I don't want to go there and counteract it. It's something that we have to deal with, is the fact that we are relaxing selection on these things, so they won't go away. Here's just some examples there. So, okay, the realization, this is the last slide here, the realization that genetics, the genetic influences on behavior can have problematic effects that are here to stay and will plague us, influences on human behavior, is probably troubling to some of us. Although, to tell you the truth, there are probably many more genetic influences on our behavior that we all agree with and are serving us very well. But I'd like to end on a positive note rather than that, the negative one, by saying that despite the fact that we have these genetic influences on our behavior that are problematic, there's nothing to say that we can't rise above them. Human biology has shown that we're remarkably plastic, and despite our evolutionary heritage and despite our culture, we can make decisions on our own. And so, for instance, we can make behavioral decisions that are in line with our evolutionary heritage. So, for instance, when we decide that incest is better off avoided, that is very good evidence that that's an evolutionary tendency as well, so it goes in line with what we would want to say. And other times we can make decisions despite contrary influences, whether those contrary influences come from our culture or from our evolution. And so, so for instance, there is evidence that we have a degree of genetic influence so we've inherited as part of our evolutionary heritage, at least partially, to adhere to the dictates of our social group. That's been important. To stay close to family. That's been important. And initially to distrust those who look different from us, or who come from a long distance away. And those kinds of influences, that third kind is particularly troubling. And yet, this South African couple here, that I photographed when we visited them in 2001, but actually they got together before the fall of apartheid, when all those influences, cultural, and if there was any latent xenophobia, if there was any predisposition to follow the parents' wishes, or to adhere to the social group, or to follow the norms of the culture, or to obey the law, all of these things were contradicted by just their love for each other. There was nothing else going for them because of that, because the woman's family disowned her, and the guy's social group ridiculed him, and he was kicked off the boxing team in Pretoria, where he was a very promising boxer. And they stayed together throughout the fall of apartheid against all of these influences. So the lesson here is that we are always being pulled, and it was against the law to do so. And you know, the law under apartheid isn't something that you want to mess with too much. So we are always being pulled in various directions by both evolutionary and cultural factors. And our decisions, nevertheless, are still our own. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, David, for a great overview there. So I'm sure that's raised also lots of questions. And immediately at the back. Yes, please. Let's start there and go over there. Yes.
Thank you. That was a very informative lecture. I've got a question. When I think of the environment of a gene, I think of a proximate environment, the cytoplasm within the cell. And then I think of things more cultural, such as my mother making me eat my vegetables at dinner. So if I have a pleiotropic gene that can make 4 different proteins, how does it know which protein to make in a given environmental situation?
Well, much more commonly, what is the case is that a gene will code for one protein, but then that protein itself is really the source of the pleiotropy. And so that protein is used in different environments to do different things. So for instance, testosterone has influence on aggression, but it also has influence on hair. And those types of things are regulated differently, but it's the same hormone doing the 2 different things. So it's usually a little further down the causal pathway that the pleiotropy becomes important. But it is true that pleiotropy is important, even in epigenetics. In controlling, you can have a a gene that has an effect on another gene as well as producing its own protein.
Yes, please.
You said, if I understand this correctly, a gene.
Is that me?
It's Wednesday and it's the fire alarm and it goes off every Wednesday at about midday.
A gene is necessary plus the environment is necessary, is that correct?
What was the
They're
first?
not- A gene alone is not sufficient, environment alone is not sufficient.
That's right.
But they're both necessary.
That's right.
Okay. And then you talked a little bit about mental disorder, but you didn't mention criminal behavior, and I was wondering if you could say a bit about that?
Yeah, well, it is, so often those studies are done either in terms of finding a relationship between a previously understood mental disorder and then a particular behavioral manifestation that we would call criminal, or looking at populations such as incarcerated populations versus free populations and looking at differences in their, let's say, Y chromosome count, for instance. So they only have one Y chromosome, or the existence of two Y chromosomes is much more common in jail than it is on the street. But those kinds of things are population wide studies, and so I would hesitate to talk about genes for criminal behavior, since the genes far predate the concept of criminality. But I do believe that's almost the semantic issue, though, because really what you're talking about is something that we do call criminal, let's say rape or murder or something like that, and which may have some genetic basis to it. But keep in mind that South African couple illustration there. It doesn't mean that an individual is forced to go out there and kill somebody. I wouldn't want to see the realization of a genetic influence any more than an environmental influence or a cultural influence or an influence of your friends being used, for instance, to let somebody off the hook for a crime.
And David, isn't it worth pointing out that there is a chromosome well known, isn't there, for criminality, the Y chromosome? Because I mean, the average, if you take all the countries of the world and look at the percentage of males, it's 95, 96% of all the present populations of the world, on average, are male. So isn't it true? I mean, the Y chromosome
zero Y chromosomes would be ideal in terms of reducing crime.
Yeah, right. I just want to point that out. So. Now we've got a lot of hands, but yes, on the left there, first, thank you, yes.
Well, I have two questions. The first one is, I'm curious about the...
Speak up a little bit.
Sorry, I'm curious about the heritability of something like being musical. Is that something that's inherited, or is it something like that you're more sensitive to languages, and then it's kind of then fostered then by whatever environment you're in? Like if you're in a musical environment and you're already sensitive to sound and languages, that you would become more musical, or is it something that's something by itself? And the second question is, why do humans like things like coffee and nicotine?
Well, with regard to your first question, there is a bloom in studies of various arts-related behaviors and the degree to which they are culturally versus individually innovated, or culturally influenced versus individually innovative versus inherited tendencies. And actually out of that literature comes that developmental plasticity of virtuosity, which is not an appreciation of music, but it's an ability to just move your muscles very quickly while producing it. But I don't know what the answer is going to be to that. All I can say is that in general, I don't doubt that there will be genes that you will not be surprised to learn of the importance of certain genes relating to auditory processing, or other genes that are regarding other things that may be tonal or similar to music in our life and have been for a long time, that modulate a little bit of the difference between some people who don't appreciate music very much and people who do, just as people have done those kinds of studies on wine tasters, for instance. But on the other hand, music is something that is immensely culturally variable in its importance and the kinds of music that is important. And so I suspect that music appreciation will be more of a cultural universal. We'll find genes that are universal to that, but how that instantiates itself in different cultures will be vastly different. Now, in terms of drug use, there are many different explanations. There are levels of explanation. So, for instance, there is the level of explanation that says, oh, well, caffeine binds to particular receptors that are usually bound by other proteins that have to do with sleep and those kinds of things. And but that is the mechanistic explanation. Generally speaking, I'm looking at a different level, which is evolutionary history and function. Two other of the 4 or 5 levels of explanation there are in these kinds of things. And so I would say that basically it's parasitizing part of our heritage, and it doesn't actually have an evolutionary history in and of itself for the most part. Now, there may be some genetic evolution in the human species for certain substances that have been in long use. And some people have claimed that cannabis is one of those. I don't really hold that view myself. I think it just comes out of a very idiosyncratic literature. But it's theoretically possible, like something like alcohol, for instance. We could have evolved since the first uses of alcohol.
Okay, so, yes, please.
I wanted
Yes.
to ask you about homosexuality. I don't think you mentioned that unless my mind drifted at some point. This is, to a certain extent, a controversial issue, but in a certain sense it's not a controversial issue at all, because homosexuality exists in other animals, and I would imagine that it must be connected to some genes, just like mental illness, as you showed, etc. My question is really about the cultural effects. First of all, people tend to point out, I don't know how valid those references are, tend to mention that there is cultural spread in homosexuality. You don't find it equally distributed in all societies.
Mm-hmm.
So there must be some cultural effect, which I would like to hear about on your opinion. And secondly, more importantly, you mentioned the cultural counter effect, so to speak, to hinder some genetic manifestations.
Mm-hmm.
And so in the States nowadays, as you're perfectly aware, there are these controversial claims that people can subject homosexuals to therapy and blah, blah. I'm not defending or promoting any of this. I'm just asking if cultural effects can be claimed to be counter effects to something that is inherently genetic, such as homosexuality or other.
Yeah, I think that the evidence is rather clear on 2 points. There's a lot of things that are not clear about this, and homosexuality is one of those things. It shares. It's similar to to morality, in the sense that both of these things are things that we have one word for when they manifest themselves in our consciousness or in our culture, and yet they are actually a combination of things when you look further back on the causal pathway. So in other words, homosexuality isn't just one thing, and it doesn't have just one history to it. We have taken a conglomerate of things based on its manifestation, and we've called it one thing. That's one thing I think that is important to realize with respect to any human cultural institution, or something like a lifestyle, or something like marriage, or anything that that we have a name for purely on the basis of its phenomenology or in a cultural manifestation. It could have several different backgrounds. And the second thing I think the literature supports very well is that homosexuality is present in other animals, but only in some of those senses, not in all of them. So for instance, I think it would be rather insulting to a lot of homosexuals to ascribe to them purely homoeroticism, being sexually attracted to members of the same sex, rather than giving them the possibility of having an extended relationship in replacement of the typical or more common relationship that males and females have. Now, that particular aspect of homosexuality is not seen in nature on a wide basis. You may find specific instances of it, just like you'll find specific instances of all sorts of things, but in terms of fixed traits in populations, based on the literature, and I would actually predict that you will never find a species that has some proportion of its members foregoing reproduction for the sake of sexual, so sexual meaning, ordinarily leading to reproduction in the heterosexual case, not leading to reproduction in the homosexual case. So I don't think there are homosexual relationships in nature. There's homoeroticism, and there is the use of sex, same-sex sex, in order for a variety of functions. For instance, in bonobos, there is female same-sex stimulation that is used in adjudicating, or after the adjudicating of disputes, to re-cement relationships. And it doesn't have anything to do with reproduction. It's not related to reproduction. And the relationship there is not a substitute for those bonobos having ordinary reproductive relationships at the same time. Now, in terms of the evolutionary history, okay, you mentioned the cultural diversity of it. I think it is possible for there to be significant cultural diversity in homosexuality if we define it in terms of its manifestation, because our cultures are important determinants of what. I think there's a lot of plasticity in this behavior, as in all, enormous plasticity. And the environments that we have, and there are many good examples of the particular forms of homosexuality being related to different environmental influences, are not to be taken lightly. And also individual choice, I think, is also important, and cultures influence that choice. So I don't think, at the most gross level, you can imagine just the prohibition of homosexuality will itself be enough of a cultural influence to cause a detectable decrease in the amount in that culture, I would say. Because there are a lot of people who do not, go against the cultural norms. So I think that in and of itself is evidence that the cultural manifestation. Now, in terms of an inner desire, those kinds of things, these things often develop in a process of self-inquiry and cognitive cognitive social development. And there are some cases when that will tend to lead one in one direction, and some that will tend to go in another direction. There's one hypothesis out there that a free society, or a society where sexuality is freely explored, will lead to the most accurate approximation of what the tendencies are, for instance, and that makes sense. But there's other people who say that it'll actually exacerbate. It will make more differences in lifestyles than actually one has measurable predispositions for, just because people, it's almost like picking things off the shelf. You can just go up to it just regardless of your inherited dispositions, and if there are many lifestyles that are equally acceptable, then you will pick one off the shelf, not necessarily in line with any particular disposition. But I know there's many issues of relating this, and I've only gotten at some of the questions you've raised.
Thank you very much. Yes, please, Ben. Yeah.
It's probably an easy question to answer, but I was just curious. When the studies are done on the influence of acquired understanding or nurture, does that start with experiences in the womb, or does it start from birth?
Definitely experiences in the womb. The reason I paused is because I was trying to think of acquired traits that happen from the time of conception before there is even the zygote in the womb. And I'm sure that we will find that there is, because there is a hormonal environment even early on, before the womb is even formed. But certainly in the womb, there are maternal effects, environmental maternal effects. Maternal effects can be genetic or environmental in origin. So the environmental maternal effects are effects of the maternal environment while one is in the womb. And these have been studied, many different kinds of.
Can I ask you a question? Now there is practice of surrogate motherhood.
Mm-hmm.
It means that the mother who delivers is not actually a mother of the egg. What happens genetically? What is your hypothesis?
Nothing would happen genetically, but the interaction between the genotype of the fetus and the genotype of the mother and the environmental differences between that woman and the genetic mother may have an effect on the offspring. Now, if there are genetic incompatibilities, then this could have detrimental effects. There are certain people who could be genetically incompatible with each other in certain kinds of ways over and above just blood type.
But mutations are impossible.
Well, mutations happen even in the womb, but as long as they are not in the cells that lead to reproduction, then they won't have any effect. But I don't think there's a difference in mutation between surrogate a fetus and surrogate mother and a fetus and a genetic mother. I don't see any reason to expect that.
So if these mutations happen during pregnancy, what manifestations would you expect?
If the fetus has mutations while it's developing,
Yes.
that is almost certainly going to be the case. And generally speaking, what will happen is things like that. I mean, it's just a slight overproduction of melanism. You know what I mean? It's a freckle or whatever. There are many different. That's just I'm being facetious to say that all of our cells are slightly imperfectly replicating and dividing, meaning that not the cells, the genetic material. When the cells divide, the genetic material is not completely perfect in its replication, and so you're going to have mutations, but they're not going to be passed on to the offspring, and most of them are not going to have effects on the phenotype.
Just on that point, while we're still on development in the womb, I mean, in terms of monozygotic twins and reared apart and all that kind of thing, it often seems to me that there's a lot of complicating factors that come into the interpretation, aren't there? For example, they share the same womb, they have a competition there for resources in the womb, and then also very often they're not separated until some time actually after birth, so there's a very early bonding experience with the same genetic mother and so forth. And then also because they look identical, the environment will respond to those individuals in a very similar kind of way, probably. I mean,
That's
how
a
we
good point.
look shapes our environment, doesn't it? So
That's right.
I often wonder, you know, in these studies, whether those factors are really factored in to the whole inheritance thing. I mean, what do you think about that sort of thing?
That's a very important caveat to make with twin studies, and it's an important reason why we should actually go deeper and look into the mechanisms themselves, because that thing that I mentioned as troublesome to a study of heritability is also troublesome to twin studies, which is the gene-environment correlation, and also the little bit of similarity of environment that they do actually get in their early life. I mean, in that, when I say little bit, I just mean in terms of the lifespan of a human, but it's extremely important in terms of its effects. In general, a rule of thumb is, if you have an influence in early development, is going to be vastly more important in shaping traits than in later development. So if you, it's basically a negative slope line. Same influence in early development will have well, depends on what your y or x-axis are. So if you have the same influence in early development, it will have a great influence generally on your traits, whereas the same influence later in development will have a less influence because it happens through development. And so this issue is more than just a caveat. It's something that we really must take seriously, because this is the time period where we're having most of our influences.
A question over here. Is it still there? Yes? Yeah.
Could you give an example of genetic incompatibility between people that goes beyond stuff like blood type?
Okay.
Can you just repeat that question?
Okay, could I give an example of genetic incompatibility between people that goes beyond blood type? Now, some of them are controversial. I'll give just a very simple one that is not controversial. And that is if you have two recessive alleles, both of which together will cause a disease. So for instance, since I used the example of Huntington's disease, there are different levels of Huntington's disease. If you have one of these recessive alleles, you will have a 28% chance of contracting the disease. If you have two of these alleles, you have 40, but if you contract one form or another form of the alleles, it's 28 and 40%. But if you have them from both of your parents, then you have a 100% chance of contracting the disease. So that would be something that I would consider to be a genetic incompatibility. Many of them manifest themselves before the baby is born, so you basically would never even be born if you have certain kinds of genetic incompatibilities. The ones that are more controversial are the ones that are related to, say, MHC, so in other words, your resistance to certain diseases. Some that have to do with race or social or ethnic group specific conditions that can be disturbed, for instance, by if you have alleles from another more distantly related population, but those are more controversial, such as, for instance, resistance to malaria. If you have an African who marries, a black African, a sub-Saharan African who marries or mates with a person who does not have resistance to malaria, then that's going to affect the offspring's resistance to malaria, and it will actually not be just between the two of them. It'll actually be worse than her husband's if he didn't have it.
Please, yes.
We had a debate yesterday at the bar whether religious belief is more, or should we say, is inherited from parents, from a background, from cultural background, or is it innate or developed in life?
Well,
That's a topic for this afternoon.
yeah, that's my 4 o'clock topic.
Yes.
Well, but I don't. But the answer is that I don't know. So it's not really my talk this afternoon. But so I say at the beginning of the talk that I just as the music, my answer would have to be the same as the music thing. I would say that there, as a rule of thumb, probably there are universals that we have inherited that make us capable of being religious people. And there are certain tendencies that may make us more likely to be religious than not. But that overwhelmingly, culture comes to bear on this in a particular religion that you're looking at. And so I would suspect that if we wanted to look at the causes with the greatest effects, we should look in the latter category, in the cultural and individual category.
So there are no genes for being an Anglican, you think?
Anything that has happened over the last, I would say, 12 to 30,000 years and hasn't happened before that, and I would put religion in that category. Anything that it took less than 30,000 to 40,000 years to come about, there are no genes that specifically evolved, no allele forms specifically evolved to foster that particular behavior. Now, if Anglicans happen to be fond of sugar more than me, then obviously.
Let's not have a quick one. Yes, please. Yes. Time for one more question. That's your question. Yes.
You said there's a predisposition, genetic predisposition to ADHD.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder how we should be thinking about dealing with environment and genetics in something like ADHD, the attention deficit disorder in schools and things like that. How do you think we should actually start thinking about how to deal with the problem in children who have it?
That is a conundrum because there are people who are going from, well, this is a risk factor. It happens to be a genetic risk factor. So clinicians will approach that without any difference between the way that between that and the way they would approach another kind of risk factor, a behavioral risk factor, environmental risk factor. And yet it is different because our genes can only be manipulated in a very minor way after we have been tested, whereas the other things could be removed, perhaps. And so I am wary of genetic therapy for those kinds of things, but I realize that in a very specified place, so that if those genes, for instance, in the lateral medial, tip of the reticular formation or the hippocampus, right there, if you could change the genes right there and have this impact, and there's been good studies of its lack of pleiotropy with other genes, then it's possible. But I just think it's so epigenetics and other genetic interactions are so much the rule that I'm worried about gene therapy and its byproducts or by effects. So I'm not sure about what the future is for that.
Okay, well, time is up, and really this has been a fascinating talk, and I think this discussion will carry on for the rest of the day as well. So thank you very much, David.